January 1943. The cold came before the dawn. It seeped through the tin walls of the hangar, crawled under the canvas covers, and bit at the fingers of every man who dared touch steel before sunrise. The engines slept in rows, their dark forms glistening with frost, like beasts waiting to wake. The smell of oil hung thick in the air. Somewhere, a wrench clinked against metal, the only sound breaking the stillness of the winter morning. Beyond the airfield, the horizon was a smear of pale blue, and the war was already awake. Harold Finch stood alone beneath the belly of a bomber, his breath clouding as he leaned into the open wiring panel. The metal was so cold it burned his skin. He had been standing there since before midnight, tracing circuits, testing relays, hoping for something, a clue, a spark, an answer. Another plane had gone down last night. No enemy fire, no storm, no sign of struggle. Just a flicker of light in the clouds and then silence. The men in the mess hall said it was bad luck. Finch didn't believe in luck. He had seen the same thing too many times. Each crash report told a story written in smoke and failure, and always the cause remained unknown. To the higher-ups, that word meant nothing. To Finch, it was a curse. He crouched lower, running his finger along the insulation of a power cable. It was frayed, scorched in a single place, as if something had bitten through it. He stared at it for a long moment. That same mark had appeared on every downed aircraft. The same place, the same burn. It made no sense. He closed his eyes and pictured his brother's face. Arthur Finch, navigator, 47 Squadron. His plane had gone down 6 months ago. The official report said mechanical failure. The same phrase that now haunted Harold's every waking hour. The sound of boots echoed behind him. Sergeant Miller approached, coat buttoned high against the cold. "Finch," he called out, "command wants that plane flying by noon." Finch didn't look up. "If it flies, it dies," he muttered. "What's that?" He straightened, the ache in his knees sharp from the cold. "Nothing, sir. Just a faulty relay. I'll sort it." Miller nodded, unconvinced. "Just make sure it's ready. We're losing more birds than we can replace." He turned and disappeared into the mist. Finch watched him go, then knelt again. His breath fogged the panel as he whispered, almost to himself, "It's not the relay." He touched the scorched wire once more. Something's wrong inside. Outside, a generator coughed to life. The whine of engines rolled through the hangar like distant thunder. Men hurried to load bombs, check instruments, and paint over bullet holes that told stories they'd never speak of again. Finch stayed where he was, lost in the hum of the base. Every spark, every tremor in the metal seemed to whisper to him. It was like the machines were alive and dying in slow motion. By midday, the air was filled with the roar of propellers. Crews climbed aboard their aircraft, waving to those on the ground with the kind of smiles only men about to face death could manage. Finch watched them, silent. His eyes followed the lead bomber as it taxied down the icy runway. Engines screamed. Snow and dust whipped across the tarmac. The aircraft lifted steady, strong, and vanished into the clouds. Minutes later, a bright flash lit the horizon. A column of smoke rose where the sky had been whole a moment before. Finch froze around him, shouts erupted. Radios crackled, voices shouted bearings, coordinates, orders. He heard none of it. He just stared into the distance, where pieces of metal rained down like ash. Another one gone, same fault, same silence. He lowered his head, his hands trembling. "I'm missing something," he whispered, "something right in front of me." As the smoke drifted across the frozen fields, he turned back toward the open wiring panel. The faint scent of burning insulation reached his nose, sharp and bitter. It was the same smell that haunted every crash site. He leaned closer, staring at the wires as if they could speak. "What are you trying to tell me?" Outside, the last echoes of the explosion faded into the wind. The hangar lights flickered once, then steadied as if mocking him. Harold Finch picked up his wrench again. He would not leave, not tonight, not until he understood why those men kept dying before they ever saw the enemy. The war was being lost not in the skies above France but here, in the silence beneath a bomber's wing. And as the daylight dimmed into another bitter evening, Finch swore to himself that he would find the fault even if it killed him too. Part 2 night fell early that winter. The sun dipped behind the hangars before most men had even finished their rations, leaving the airfield cloaked in a dull orange haze from the floodlights. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavy, thick flakes melting as they touched the heat of the engine blocks. Finch hadn't moved for hours. The other mechanics had gone to the barracks, leaving him alone with the metallic silence. His hands were black with oil, his fingertips raw from the cold. Yet he stayed, hunched over the same section of wire, tracing it again and again, refusing to surrender. Each aircraft was identical, yet something invisible kept killing them. A ghost in the system. He had replaced every fuse, checked every ground line, recalibrated the instruments. Still, the same fault returned, the same place, the same burn. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. His breath came out in heavy clouds. Somewhere beyond the hangar, he could hear muffled laughter, pilots drinking to forget, or perhaps to remember. He envied them in a strange way. Their war was brief and violent. His was endless, buried in wires and silence. He picked up a worn logbook, flipping through pages of technical notes. Every page told the same story: circuits burned out mid-flight, ignition faults that appeared from nowhere, melted connections that shouldn't have melted. He pressed his thumb against one of the sketches, the ink smudging beneath the grease. He could feel it, the answer was near. He just didn't know how to see it yet. At the far end of the hangar, a single bulb flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed half the room. Finch exhaled slowly and muttered, "Fitting, isn't it?" He reached for a small lantern, lit it, and set it beside the open wiring bay. The flame cast trembling light across the bomber's skin. It revealed his own reflection, hollow-eyed, gaunt, but burning with the same quiet defiance that had kept him alive this long. He touched the damaged cable once more, feeling its texture, the brittle insulation splitting under his thumb. That's when he noticed something, a faint line of moisture along the wire, freezing in the cold. Condensation. He frowned. It shouldn't be there. The electrical system was supposed to be sealed tight. Yet there it was, a thin film of frost where the casing met the hull. He leaned closer, the flame flickering dangerously near the panel. Moisture, vibration, heat. He whispered, the thought dug deep into his mind. Maybe it wasn't the wiring itself. Maybe it was how the aircraft moved. The vibration of the engines, the resonance of the metal frame, the constant shaking at altitude could be creating micro-arcs, tiny sparks invisible from the ground. Sparks that could ignite the fuel vapors running near the fuselage. He sat back slowly, staring at the bomber as if seeing it for the first time. "It's not a fault," he murmured. "It's a frequency." The theory was fragile, almost ridiculous, but it was the first thing that made sense in months. He reached for his notes, scribbling with shaking hands. Resonant current, fuselage vibration, static discharge potential. The pencil tore through the paper. He didn't care. His mind was moving faster than his body could follow. A sudden gust blew through the open door, scattering his papers across the hangar floor. He lunged after them, grabbing at sheets as they slid under the bomber's wheels. One stopped near the shadowed edge of the hangar, beside a pile of wreckage salvaged from the last crash. Among the twisted metal and shattered glass, something caught the lantern's glow. A piece of wire fused to a jagged panel, blackened at the edges but smooth at the point of contact, like molten glass cooled too quickly. Finch froze. He crouched, picked it up carefully, turning it in his palm. It was almost beautiful in its destruction. The melted end had formed a curve, a perfect arch, as though the current had danced there before dying. He stared at it, then looked back toward the bomber's open panel. The same point, the same burn. His heartbeat quickened. The air around him seemed to thicken. "It's arcing." He whispered, "God, it's arcing inside the frame." He stood abruptly, almost knocking over the lantern. His hands shook with the realization. Every crash, every unexplained explosion had started the same way. A static buildup discharging through the aircraft's skeleton, igniting vapors during ascent. It wasn't a design flaw. It was physics itself, invisible and merciless. But if he was right, that meant every bomber on the base was a ticking bomb. He looked around the hangar at the silent shapes waiting for dawn, at the names painted on their noses, at the men who would fly them come morning. His throat tightened. He needed proof. He grabbed a spool of copper wire, a voltmeter, and a set of clamps. He worked through the night, testing resistance across the frame, measuring current where there should have been none. Each reading confirmed it, residual charge, building even while grounded. By the time the first light crept through the cracked windows, Finch was shaking with exhaustion. The hangar smelled of burnt insulation and coffee gone cold. But he didn't feel defeated anymore. For the first time in months, he felt close. He sat on the concrete floor, staring at the numbers he'd written across a sheet of oil-stained paper. It wasn't just an electrical issue. It was a pattern, a rhythm. The aircraft itself was playing a deadly tune, and the wires were its instrument. He leaned back against the wheel, eyes half closed. "You're killing them without even knowing it," he said softly to the machine towering over him. "But I'll find a way to stop it." Outside, the morning horn sounded, calling the crews to another mission. The sound echoed through the hangar, mingling with the whisper of falling snow. Finch didn't move. His eyes stayed on the notes in front of him, the words blurring through fatigue. Somewhere deep inside, a single thought began to form a spark that would, one day soon, become something extraordinary. He whispered it into the cold air, barely audible. There has to be a way to ground it. He didn't know it yet, but the idea that had just flickered to life in his mind would change everything. And before the month was over, it would save 200 lives. Part 1. By the end of February 1943, the airfield had turned into a graveyard of wings. Each dawn, fresh crews arrived. By dusk, half of them were gone. The snow no longer looked white, it was grey, soaked with oil and smoke. Finch hadn't slept in 2 days. He lived between the hangars now, surrounded by unfinished repairs and ghosts that never stopped whispering. He had proof that something in the wiring was killing the planes, but no one wanted to listen. Reports piled up faster than the wrecks. Command called them technical anomalies. Finch called them what they were: time bombs hidden beneath steel and rivets. He had tried to explain it once, standing in front of the senior engineers, his notes trembling in his hands. The vibration builds current through the fuselage. He'd said, "It's like the aircraft is charging itself until it sparks enough." An officer cut him off. "You're telling us a machine shocks itself to death." Laughter filled the room. Finch had stood in silence, his face burning, until they dismissed him with a wave. After that, he stopped speaking and started working. Now, every night, he tested one more bomber. Every morning, another failed. The men began to look at him differently, not with respect, but with something closer to suspicion. He was the one always near the doomed planes, always muttering to himself, always watching. Rain replaced snow that week. It poured through the cracks in the hangar roof, running in black streaks down the walls. The air smelled of rust and soaked canvas. Finch wiped his hands on a rag that never got clean, the fabric stiff with grease. He pulled open another engine panel and stared into the dark maze of wires. "You're hiding something," he whispered. The lights flickered above him, a sudden pulse, bright then dim, like a heartbeat skipping. Finch froze. He looked up, following the rhythm. Every time the wind rattled the hangar, the bulbs trembled in time. The entire building was alive with vibration. It struck him how fragile everything was. One surge, one spark, and this place could vanish in fire. He climbed into the cockpit, brushing away rainwater that had pooled on the seat. The smell of rubber, fuel, and cold metal filled his lungs. He reached for the ignition switch, hesitated, then turned it. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The floor shuddered beneath him. Dials quivered on their needles. Finch closed his eyes and listened. There it was, the hum he had come to know too well, a low, rising vibration that built like a whisper through the frame. He felt it in his fingertips, in the soles of his boots, in his teeth. The aircraft was shaking itself apart, piece by piece, and no one else could hear it. He cut the power and the silence hit him like a slap. The ticking of cooling metal filled the void. He sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, staring out through the rain. Blurred canopy. The radio on the console crackled to life. A distant voice. Another one down, grid 4-7, over the channel. No survivors. Finch closed his eyes. He stepped out of the plane, the rain soaking through his uniform. He didn't bother to cover the open panel. There was no point anymore. The storm was relentless, and so was the truth. He walked to the edge of the hangar, where the wind tore through the open doors, and stared out at the airstrip. Trucks moved slowly through puddles, towing the remains of another bomber under a tarp. Somewhere behind him, Miller's voice broke through the storm. "Finch, you're off the line for now. Investigators are coming in from London. Let them handle it." Finch turned, water dripping from his hair, his face unreadable. "They'll find nothing," he said quietly. "Then maybe there's nothing to find." He almost laughed, a dry, bitter sound swallowed by the wind. "Tell that to the men burning in the sea." Miller looked away, jaw tight. "Get some rest, that's an order." Finch watched him leave, then turned back toward the wreck being dragged across the field. Smoke still rose from its twisted frame. Even through the rain, he could smell the burnt insulation, the same scent that followed every crash. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. He walked back to the hangar, pulled the heavy doors shut against the storm, and lit his lantern. The dim flame caught the glint of metal, the shapes of broken tools, and the shadow of a man who refused to give up. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, Harold Finch began again. He didn't know it yet, but the harder he fought the system, the more dangerous his defiance would become. Because the next failure wouldn't just break a machine, it would break the patience of command. Part 2. The investigators arrived 2 days later, men in pressed uniforms, faces too clean for this place. Their boots barely touched the mud as they crossed the field, clipboards in hand, voices calm and clipped. To them, this wasn't a tragedy, it was an equation to be balanced. Finch watched from a distance as they inspected the wreckage under the tarpaulin. They pointed, nodded, scribbled notes, and moved on. They never got their hands dirty, never crouched close enough to smell the truth, the bitter stench of burnt insulation and human loss. By midday, they had their answer. Overloading in the ignition relays, one of them announced, "It's a maintenance fault." Finch stepped forward before he could stop himself. "It's not the relays," he said, voice low but steady. "We've replaced them in every unit. The problem's in the frame." The man looked at him with practiced patience. "And you are?" "Corporal Harold Finch, Flight Engineer, Section 12. "Oh." The investigator smiled thinly. "You're the one who sent that report about. Vibrating wires, was it?" Finch held his gaze. "Those vibrations are generating charge. The metal's alive with it. I can prove it." The investigator laughed once, polite but sharp. "Mr. Finch, we have no record of aircraft generating their own electricity spontaneously. You might consider resting before making further creative claims." Finch's fists tightened at his sides. "It's not creative. It's killing people." But the man was already walking away. Another name on a list, another problem to file and forget. That night, Finch sat alone in the hangar, the lantern throwing long shadows over the walls. The storm had passed, leaving a deep, heavy quiet. Somewhere in that silence, he felt a presence, the echo of all the voices that would never return. He spread his papers across the floor, sketches of circuits, readings from voltmeters, fragments of melted wire he had saved from the wrecks. Each one told the same story. He saw patterns the others refused to see, voltage spikes matching engine RPM, burns appearing exactly where vibration would peak. The data didn't lie. He leaned over the mess of pages, whispering under his breath. If the vibration's creating current, then the charge needs somewhere to go, somewhere to escape. His eyes darted across the diagram, one wire, one loop, one exit point. If I can ground it. He trailed off, his mind racing. But there was no time to test theories. Command had already ordered the next wave of missions. The bombers would fly at dawn, with or without his fix. He stood abruptly, gathering tools, moving with the urgency of a man fighting time itself. If no one believed him, he'd prove it in silence. He started with the grounded cables, running lines from the fuselage to a crude metal spike driven into the hangar floor. The readings steadied, just slightly enough to make his heart quicken. He worked until his vision blurred, until the world shrank to the sound of his own breath and the ticking of the voltmeter. He could hear the engines warming outside, men shouting, boots on gravel, the rhythm of departure. Miller burst through the hangar doors, raincoat half, buttoned, face pale. "Finch, what in God's name are you doing? Those planes are rolling out." "I'm fixing the real problem," Finch said without looking up. "If they go up like this, they won't come back. Orders say otherwise. Get out of there." Finch, his voice hardened. "Orders don't keep planes in the air." Miller hesitated. He had seen too many bodies pulled from wreckage to argue with conviction. "You've got 5 minutes, he said finally. "Then I pull you out myself." Finch nodded once, not stopping. He tightened the last bolt, checked the meter. The numbers held steady, cleaner than before. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was hope. The engines outside roared louder. He stepped out into the rain just as the first bomber began to roll down the runway. He stood there, drenched, heart-pounding, watching it lift through the fog. Seconds stretched like hours, then silence, no explosion, no flash, just the steady, rising hum of engines fading into the clouds. He exhaled shakily, almost laughing. But before relief could settle, the radio inside the hangar crackled to life. Static, then a voice, distorted and panicked. "Base command, this is Alpha 2, we're losing instruments. Controls unresponsive." A burst of noise cut through the transmission, then nothing. Finch stared at the radio, frozen. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the field, but he knew it wasn't thunder. The door burst open again. Miller's voice was hoarse. "They're gone. Lost contact over the coast." Finch's head bowed. His hands trembled against the metal console. It wasn't enough, he whispered. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm. Around him, the hangar stood like a tomb, every plane, every tool, every scrap of wire a witness to failure. He sank onto the cold floor, the weight of every lost life pressing against his chest. "There's something I'm missing," he said through his teeth. "There's always something I'm missing." Outside, the rain began again, soft, relentless and merciless. Somewhere in that sound, Finch made a promise he didn't dare speak aloud. He would find the answer, no matter what it cost. And as lightning cracked over the airfield, the light briefly caught his face, not of a broken man, but of one preparing to fight the impossible all over again. Part 1, March 1943. The storms had passed, but the air still smelled of rain and smoke. The hangar floor was slick with oil, puddles reflecting the ghostly outlines of aircraft waiting for their turn to defy gravity, and fate. Harold Finch sat alone at his workbench, shoulders hunched, fingers trembling from exhaustion. The days had begun to blur into one long stretch of metal and failure. His report to command had vanished into silence. The investigation team had packed up, leaving nothing behind but their laughter and the same broken machines. He hadn't slept properly in a week. His bunk was untouched, a thin layer of dust gathering over the folded blanket. Instead, he slept where he worked, head on the desk, lantern burning low, dreams full of fire and falling wings. Now, in the half, light before dawn, Finch stared at a tangle of wires spread across the table like veins cut from a living thing. He could feel the war tightening around him. Every day, fewer planes took off and fewer still returned. The losses were becoming routine. People had stopped counting. He rubbed his eyes, forcing focus. There had to be a pattern. The data made sense in fragments, but the whole still eluded him. Moisture, vibration, current buildup. It was all connected, but he couldn't see the shape of it yet. He took a slow breath, steadying his hands. The cold made every movement ache. Supplies were running low. New components were months away. He scavenged what he could from scrap piles. Twisted copper, bent clamps, burnt connectors. War had no room for precision, only improvisation. A kettle hissed somewhere in the corner, forgotten on the hot plate. The smell of burnt tea filled the air. Finch barely noticed. He was lost in the steady rhythm of his thoughts, sketching circuits in pencil, erasing them, redrawing them again. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing across his notes. When he finally leaned back, the morning light had crept through the cracks in the hangar wall, cold and pale. He looked around. The others had left hours ago for the airstrip. Somewhere in the distance, engines began their low growl, readying for flight. The sound once thrilled him, now it filled him with dread. He stood, stretched stiff muscles, and moved toward the nearest grounded bomber. It was stripped bare, panels open, wires exposed as if awaiting surgery. He climbed the ladder, slid into the cockpit, and rested his hand on the control column. He could feel it again, the faint hum of static beneath his fingertips. It was subtle, but alive. The metal trembled slightly with the wind, like a sleeping creature twitching in a dream. He sat there for a long while, listening to the silence behind the sound. Every vibration had a rhythm, every rhythm a signature. What if he could tune it, break it? The idea struck like lightning, brief and blinding. He climbed down quickly, boots hitting the concrete hard. He grabbed a voltmeter, a spool of thin wire, and an old metal spoon from the mess hall, one of the last remaining after the cooks started guarding their cutlery. He needed a conductor, something smooth, something that could catch a spark without burning through. He rigged a simple test, the spoon clamped to the bomber's frame, wire running to a crude grounding rod driven into the damp earth outside. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, only that he had to try. The first reading was nothing, the second, barely a flicker, but then as the wind picked up, the needle twitched again. Finch held his breath. The aircraft vibrated softly in the gusts, and the voltmeter began to pull. Tiny surges, almost imperceptible but steady. Each vibration sent a spark of charge through the spoon, harmlessly draining into the ground. It was working. He leaned closer, eyes wide, the spoon trembling under the current. A faint blue glimmer danced along its surface, a ghost of light so small it barely existed. He reached out instinctively, and the static jumped to his finger, stinging him. He laughed, quiet, disbelieving. He had caught the current. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the spoon as if it were a sacred object. The air smelled faintly of ozone, sharp and metallic. The hair on his arms stood up. He looked around, half expecting someone to have seen it, but the hangar was empty. The proof, the spark, the answer, it was his alone. He sat down on the cold floor, heart racing, and began to sketch furiously on the back of a supply manifest. The grounding circuit, the frequency shift, the point of discharge. His handwriting was rough, uneven, but alive. He could almost hear his brother's voice, faint and far away. "You'll fix it, Harry. You always do." Finch swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Not yet," he whispered, "but I will." Outside, the wind howled through the broken shutters, rattling tools and chains. Inside, Harold Finch bent over his work, the glow of discovery flickering across his face. He didn't know it yet, but the piece of cutlery clamped to that bomber would one day change the course of every flight that followed. And it all began with a spoon that caught the light just right. Part 2, the wind outside had softened by nightfall, leaving the base wrapped in a damp, metallic quiet. Most of the men were asleep, but Finch's lamp still burned, casting long, wavering shadows across the hangar walls. The spoon glinted faintly in the half-light, its edges catching the glow like a piece of captured moon. He had moved the test setup to the far end of the hangar, away from prying eyes. His hands trembled from fatigue, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint blue arc dancing across the spoon's surface, delicate and alive proof that the current could be caught before it turned deadly. He rewired the setup, adding pieces scavenged from abandoned radios, coils, resistors, copper fragments stripped from ruined consoles. War had taken everything, but it left behind its debris, and Finch had learned long ago that genius was often found in the scraps. He worked in silence, the soft ticking of the voltmeter his only companion. Every so often he would pause, listening to the creak of the hangar roof, to the wind brushing the walls, to the distant thrum of engines far beyond the horizon. Each sound seemed to pulse in rhythm with the current running through his contraption. When he tightened the final bolt and flipped the switch, the voltmeter sprang to life. The reading surged, then steadied higher than before, but controlled. The charge was flowing smoothly through his improvised circuit, draining into the ground harmlessly. He exhaled slowly. "That's it." He whispered, "That's what you needed." But discovery was only half the battle. He had no authority to alter military hardware. No one would authorize a modification built from spare wire and a stolen spoon. He'd be caught, marshalled before he finished the second installation. He sank back into the chair, staring at the spoon gleaming in the dim light. "They'll never believe this," he murmured, "not unless they see it." His thoughts drifted to the men who flew these planes, the laughter before takeoff, the empty bunks after. Every face had begun to blur into the next, but his brothers never did. Arthur's grin before his last flight, his promise to come home. The image burned in Finch's mind until he clenched his jaw just to stay steady. He looked at the spoon again, its surface flecked with soot, a crude thing salvaged from a soldier's mess kit. But to him it looked almost wholly a small, defiant act of order in the chaos of war. He took out his notebook and began writing not a report, but a manifesto. Line by line, he described what he'd found, the vibration frequencies, the arcing pattern, the resonance build-up during takeoff. His words were quick, impatient, fueled by exhaustion and revelation. "The current seeks the path of least resistance," he wrote, "and when none exists, it finds one through destruction." He paused, tapping the pencil against the page. Then, below it, he scrawled, "Solution provide the current a path it can trust." He underlined it twice. Outside, lightning flickered in the distance far off, but enough to send a low rumble through the ground. The light spilled into the hangar for a moment, washing everything in a pale blue that made the spoon glow brighter than ever. Finch smiled faintly. "You see, even the sky agrees." He rose and moved to the next aircraft in the line, his tools clinking softly in his hands. If command wouldn't authorize a fix, he'd do it himself quietly, carefully, one plane at a time. He'd save who he could, even if they never knew why. He began fitting the spoon into the circuitry of the second bomber, connecting it to the grounding wire. The work was slow, delicate, like threading hope into the veins of a dying patient. Every connection he made hummed faintly with potential, as if the metal itself wanted to live. Hours passed unnoticed. The first light of morning crept through the windows, brushing the floor in cold silver. Finch wiped his hands on his sleeve, stepped back, and looked at his creation. It was crude, ugly, almost laughable, but real. He touched the edge of the spoon once more. No spark this time, no burn, just stillness, the plane seemed. Calm, he allowed himself a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Behind him, footsteps echoed slow, deliberate. Finch froze. He turned to see Sergeant Miller standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a cigarette burning between his fingers. "What are you doing, Finch?" Finch hesitated, "Fixing what the rest of you won't." Miller took a drag, exhaled smoke through his nose. With a spoon, Finch met his gaze with an idea. The sergeant stared at him for a long time, the faintest trace of pity in his eyes. "You're gonna get yourself thrown out, maybe worse. You know that." Finch nodded slowly. "If I do nothing, they'll keep dying." Miller flicked the cigarette away, the ember hissing in a puddle. He sighed. "You've got till inspection tomorrow. Then you hide this damn thing or take the blame yourself." He left without another word. Finch turned back to the plane, the sound of Miller's footsteps fading into the dawn. The engines outside began to stir again, that same familiar thunder rising through the fog. He placed a hand on the cold fuselage and whispered, "Hold together. Just once, hold together." The morning light caught the spoon one last time before he covered the panel, sealing it shut. The test would come soon enough. And in that moment, Finch knew for the first time since the war began that he was closer to saving lives than anyone else on that airfield. The following week brought no miracles, only orders. Command had grown restless. Too many planes lost, too many excuses. Word spread through the base that an inspection team from London was returning, this time not for reports, but for blame. Finch worked through the rumour and the rain, his head down, his hands moving with quiet precision. Every night when the hangar emptied, he unbolted a single access panel and fitted another one of his crude grounding rigs. One spoon, one wire, one chance to save a crew. He had managed to modify 3 bombers in secret before Miller caught on. By the 4th night, the sergeant found him half, buried in the guts of another plane. "You're pushing it, Finch," he said, voice low, glancing toward the open doors. "You'll hang for this if they see you." Finch didn't look up. "Then I'll hang with clean hands." "Clean?" Miller laughed softly. "You've got grease in your veins." Finch twisted a bolt tight, the sound sharp and final, better grease than blood. Miller fell silent. He didn't report him. Maybe he understood what kind of madness was born when logic and guilt met in the dark. But madness or not, Finch was running out of time. The next morning, a formation of 10 bombers was ordered to fly, an offensive across the Rhine. Among them was one of the planes he had modified. He didn't tell anyone, he couldn't. That day, the hangar buzzed with tension. Men moved quickly, their faces pale under the cold light. Mechanics shouted over the roar of engines, checking every line, every latch. Finch worked in silence, moving from plane to plane, double, checking his hidden installations. He knew which one mattered most. Captain Reeves, the pilot assigned to it, was young. Barely 25, all confidence and caffeine. He found Finch tightening a wire under the wing and grinned. "Careful, Finch," he said. "You keep her too tight, she won't want to come home." Finch forced a thin smile. "Make sure she does. This one's different." "Different how?" "Just trust the machine," Finch said and stepped back. Reeves raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Pilots didn't ask questions they didn't want answered. By noon, the airfield was swallowed by fog, engines growling through the mist like restless animals. Orders came through, all craft to depart by 1300 hours. Finch stood by the hangar door, gloves in hand, watching as ground crews cleared the snow from the runway. Every sound felt sharper, every breath colder. Then came the voice that changed everything. Finch, he turned. It was Colonel Dawes, the base commander, coat whipping in the wind, eyes like iron. 2 officers followed behind, carrying reports and suspicion. "We've had enough of your theories." Dawes barked. "You've been tampering with equipment. Unauthorized modifications. Explain yourself." Finch stood his ground. "Sir, those modifications are preventing static buildup. They could save the bombers." Dawes' face hardened. "Save them? You've compromised government property." "Government property is falling out of the sky," Finch snapped. His voice echoed across the hangar, bouncing off the steel. Men nearby stopped what they were doing. Silence rippled outward like a wave. Dawes stepped closer, voice low and deadly calm. "You think you know more than the ministry's engineers." Finch didn't blink. "I don't think, sir, I know." The colonel's jaw twitched. "If your fix fails, it's on your head." "Then let me prove it," Finch said, chest rising with every word. "One test flight. That's all I ask." Dawes studied him for a long moment, then nodded to the officers. "Fine, 1 flight, you're on board." The words hit like a hammer. Finch hesitated, just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Aye, sir." As the officers turned away, Miller appeared from the shadows, eyes wide. "You're not actually going up there, are you?" Finch met his gaze. "If I don't, no one will ever believe me." The sergeant shook his head, muttering something under his breath. But he didn't stop him. He simply said, "Then make it count." The rain returned just before takeoff. Thin sheets of it swept across the field, turning everything to silver and mud. The crews climbed aboard, faces ghostly under the flickering lamps. Finch pulled on a flight jacket 2 sizes too big and climbed the ladder into the modified bomber. Inside, the smell of fuel and cold metal filled the air. The engines rumbled like a sleeping giant. He glanced at the spoon hidden behind the access panel, now just another piece of invisible genius waiting to prove itself. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, crackling through static. "You ready back there, Finch?" He strapped himself in, hands shaking slightly. "Ready?" Outside, the fog thickened until the world was nothing but light and sound, and the roar of engines building to a scream. Finch closed his eyes. "Please work," he whispered. The plane began to move, heavy and deliberate, wheels grinding over wet tarmac. The vibrations built through the floor, up his legs, into his bones. The same pulse that had doomed so many before. But this time, something was different. The air inside felt calmer. The static hum that once crawled through the hull was fading, replaced by a steady, grounded silence. He gripped the edge of his seat as the bomber lifted, nose rising into the storm. For the first time in months, Harold Finch wasn't praying for survival. He was praying for proof. Part 2, the engines screamed against the wind as the bomber climbed through the clouds, slicing into the grey like a steel arrow. Inside the fuselage, the air was thin and heavy with fuel vapours. Every vibration echoed through the frame. each one a reminder of what Finch feared most. He sat on the cold metal floor, back against the wall, the sound of the engines vibrating through his spine. Every screw, every wire, every breath mattered now. His crude grounding rig was hidden beneath the cockpit panels. One spoon, one copper line, one desperate hope that it would hold. Altitude 10,000. The pilot's voice called from above, crossing into enemy range. Finch wiped his palms on his trousers. The gauges were steady, the needles calm. No flicker, no surge, no sign of the phantom fault that had haunted him for months. Still, his pulse refused to slow. He had seen peace in these machines before, moments before they burst into flame. A burst of radio chatter cracked through the cabin. Storm system ahead, heavy turbulence. The co-pilot cursed under his breath. Perfect bloody timing. Finch looked toward the cockpit window. The clouds ahead flashed with distant lightning. Sheets of rain hammered against the glass, the wind shoving the aircraft side to side. The storm was alive, electric and merciless. Every instinct told him to turn back, but if his modification could survive this, lightning, turbulence, static overload, then it wasn't just a fix, it was salvation. He leaned forward, eyes on the voltmeter he had rigged beside him. The needle danced at the edge of the red zone. A flicker of current surged through the hulls, small but visible. The spoon glinted behind the panel, catching the light from each electrical pulse. It was working, fighting the charge, redirecting it, keeping death at bay one spark at a time. Then the lightning hit. A flash so bright it turned the cockpit white. The plane lurched violently, alarms shrieking. The entire frame groaned as if it might tear in two. Finch was thrown against the bulkhead, pain shooting through his shoulder. Smoke curled from the left wing. The pilot shouted something, drowned by static. The smell of burning oil filled the air. Finch scrambled to the panel, ripping it open with trembling hands. His eyes widened. The spoon was glowing faintly, the wire sparking under the strain. It was holding, just barely. The current was grounding itself through the line, exactly as he designed. He shouted over the noise, "Don't cut power, keep her steady." The pilot's voice crackled back through the radio. "Are you insane? We're taking hits from the storm. Trust it." Finch yelled. Trust the circuit. For a terrifying minute, the world was nothing but noise and light, lightning slamming against steel, thunder roaring through the cabin, the smell of ozone thick enough to choke on. But slowly, impossibly, the vibrations began to even out. The needle steadied, the flickering lights brightened and held. Then came silence, the kind of silence that fills the air after death passes you by. Finch leaned against the wall, breathing hard, heart pounding in his chest. The plane held steady through the clouds, engines humming strong. He looked again at the voltmeter, steady, perfect. The spoon, blackened and charred around the edges, hung still. It had done its job, base command. The pilot's voice finally came through the radio, shaky but alive. "This is Alpha 2-7. We're through the storm, no damage. Systems holding steady. Repeat, steady." Static, then cheers erupted through the intercom. The co-pilot laughed like a man seeing daylight for the first time. "I'll be damned. She made it." Finch closed his eyes. For the first time in months, the sound of the engines didn't terrify him. It comforted him. They weren't screaming anymore. They were singing. He slumped back against the hull, exhausted, watching the horizon appear through the thinning clouds. The first rays of sunlight cut across the metal, painting the cockpit in gold. The pilot turned in his seat, grinning. "Whatever you did back there, Finch, it worked." Finch smiled faintly, voice rough. "It wasn't me. It was the spoon." The crew laughed, the tension breaking like the storm behind them. But Finch didn't join in. He just stared at the instrument panel, at the calm hum of a machine finally at peace, and whispered under his breath, "Arthur, we did it." As the bomber descended toward base, the radio tower came alive with confused chattercon, formation reports, disbelief, excitement. The crew's safe return spread like wildfire. By the time the wheels touched the runway, half the base had gathered outside. Mechanics, officers, even the cooks crowded near the landing strip. Their faces turned upward as the aircraft rolled to a halt. The engines died, replaced by applause muffled by the wind. Finch stepped down from the hatch, soaked, trembling and half blind from exhaustion. Miller was waiting at the bottom of the ladder, rain dripping from his cap. He didn't speak at first, just stared. Then he grinned. "You did it, you mad bastard." Finch smiled weakly. "Told you she'd hold." Miller clapped him on the shoulder. "What do you call that thing?" Finch looked back toward the cockpit, where the blackened spoon still hung behind the panel. "A miracle," he said softly, "made from a mess kit." Laughter rippled through the small crowd, the kind that only comes from relief. But as the cheering grew, Finch's smile faded into something quieter, something deeper. He knew this victory wouldn't last. Command would question, dissect, and dismiss it until there was nothing left but paperwork and denial. Still, for this one moment, under the grey skies of a war that had forgotten compassion, a single act of stubborn genius had kept death waiting. And as Finch walked back toward the hangar, the world around him seemed to hum with new life. The engines, the rain, even the wind. The impossible had held. Part 1, the morning after the storm, felt different. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, the air cold and clean, almost gentle. The hangar doors stood open, letting the sunlight spill across the floor like a blessing. For once, it didn't smell like failure. Finch sat at the edge of the runway, coat draped over his shoulders, hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept, but his exhaustion was quiet now, no longer sharp and frantic. The sound of the engines still echoed in his mind, the steady hum of the plane that hadn't exploded, the rhythm of survival. The flight had worked. The modification held through lightning, turbulence, and the fury of a storm that would have destroyed every plane before it. He could still see the glow of the spoon in his mind, that faint blue shimmer catching the current before it killed. It was crude, imperfect, almost absurd. Yet it had done what an entire engineering corps could not. When the news spread through the base, it carried faster than orders. Mechanics stopped their work to whisper about it. Pilots clapped him on the back, laughing like children who had just cheated death. Even the skeptics went quiet, but command, they hated miracles. By mid-morning, Finch was summoned to the operations office. The room smelled of tobacco and authority. Colonel Dawes sat behind the desk, papers spread before him, Finch's reports, his sketches, his confessions written in grease and sleepless handwriting. Dawes didn't look up right away. He just tapped the end of his pen against the desk. "They tell me your modification prevented another explosion." Finch stood stiffly. "Yes, sir. The grounding unit redirected the I didn't ask for a lecture." Dawes cut in. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "I asked if it worked." Finch hesitated. "It did, sir." A long silence followed. Then Dawes nodded once. "You're lucky it did." "Lucky?" Finch asked quietly. "It wasn't luck. It was physics." Dawes' expression hardened. "Physics doesn't authorize equipment changes on government property. You're relieved of maintenance duty until further notice." The words hit like a blow. Finch opened his mouth, then stopped himself. The truth was useless against bureaucracy. He had done what was right, and now he was paying for it. Outside, the base was alive with movement bombers being refueled, crews checking instruments, laughter echoing from the mess hall. War didn't stop for politics, and it certainly didn't stop for justice. Miller found him later, sitting on the wing of the same plane that had survived the storm. "They really pulled you off the line." Finch nodded, eyes distant. "They think I got lucky." Miller spat on the ground. "Luck doesn't hold through lightning." Finch managed a weak smile. "You tell them that." "I already did." Miller said. "Didn't help, but word's spreading. Every crew on the base wants that spoon fix. They're calling it the Finch ground." Finch blinked. "The what?" Miller shrugged. "Or the spoon mod, depending on who you ask. Either way, they want it on their planes before the next run." For the first time in months, Finch laughed a short, startled sound. "A spoon," he said, "all this time, and that's what it comes down to." Miller smirked. "Genius hides in the stupidest places." But Finch's laughter faded quickly. The thought that men's lives now depended on a scavenged piece of metal twisted in his chest. It wasn't the fix he wanted. It was the only one he had. As the day wore on, more bombers lined up for inspection. Mechanics from other units came to ask questions, carrying notes and spare parts. Finch walked them through the process quietly, showing them how to attach the grounding wire, how to secure the spoon so it caught the charge at the right angle. Each demonstration felt surreal, like teaching someone to light a candle in a hurricane. By afternoon, 6 bombers were ready, each fitted with his crude invention, each about to fly into the kind of sky that had killed so many before. The sun dipped low behind the hangars, painting everything in gold and shadow. Finch stood at the edge of the runway again, watching as the first modified bomber taxied into position. Its engines roared, shaking the earth beneath his boots. "Here we go," a miller said beside him. Finch said nothing. His eyes followed the plane as it gained speed, wheels cutting through puddles, wings lifting into the fading light. The takeoff was smooth, no sparks, no tremors, just a clean ascent into the clouds. Then another followed, and another. One by one, the planes rose, disappearing into the evening sky. 10 machines that had once been death traps, now flying steady and sure. For a moment, the airfield fell silent. Everyone watched, waiting for the sound. They all feared, that distant, dreadful explosion. But the sky stayed quiet. Minutes stretched, then the radio crackled to life. A voice, breathless but clear. "Base command, this is Delta Squadron. We're across the channel, all systems normal, she's holding steady." A wave of cheers erupted across the runway. Men shouted, clapped backs, laughed until their throats gave out. Some even cried. Finch just stood still, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. He closed his eyes, letting the noise fade around him. The hum of the engines overhead sounded almost like music now, not of war, but of survival. He whispered to himself it worked, but deep down he already knew the truth. The fix might save lives, but it wouldn't save him. Command would never let an unranked mechanic rewrite their machines. And though the planes flew higher than ever, Harold Finch, his fate was about to fall back to earth. Part 2, by nightfall, the celebration had dimmed into quiet disbelief. The hangar lights flickered softly against the wet tarmac, and for once, no one shouted, no one cursed, no one spoke about wreckage. Every bomber that had left that afternoon returned home intact. Not one was missing. Finch stood in the shadows by the hangar door, his clothes soaked through from the drizzle, his eyes fixed on the line of returning aircraft. The roar of their engines used to sound like ghosts to him, each one a reminder of the men who never made it back. But tonight that sound was different. Tonight it meant life. When the last plane touched down and rolled to a stop, the base erupted. Crews ran from the barracks, cheering, waving their caps in the air. Men who hadn't smiled in months embraced each other. It wasn't just a victory, it was survival against every law of chance. Finch watched silently as Captain Reeves climbed out of his bomber, drenched in sweat and triumph. He saw him searching the crowd until their eyes met. Reeves didn't say a word, he just nodded once, a gesture that said everything words couldn't. Miller appeared beside Finch, grinning like a man seeing sunlight for the first time. "You did it," he said. "Every single one of them came back, not a single fault, not a spark." Finch exhaled, a long, trembling breath that seemed to empty months of fear. "They're safe," he murmured. "For now," Miller added softly, "but Dawes is fuming. He knows the fix came from you." Finch turned to him, his expression unreadable. "He can take the credit, I don't care." But Miller shook his head. "That's not how men like him work. They'll bury it, Finch, bury you with it if they have to." The words hung in the damp air, heavy and true. Inside the hangar, the celebration continued, laughter echoing off the metal walls, boots clattering against the floor, the sound of life returning to men who'd forgotten it. Finch stayed outside, alone with his thoughts, the rain cooling on his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spoon, blackened, warped, the metal scarred from the storm test. He turned it over in his hand. To anyone else, it was nothing but scrap. But to him, it was proof that something so small, so ordinary, could hold the weight of 200 lives. He closed his hand around it. "It's enough," he whispered. A door creaked open behind him. Colonel Dawes stepped out, the light from inside framing his figure in gold. His tone was flat. "Enjoying your moment, Finch?" Finch didn't turn. "Just breathing, sir. Haven't done much of that lately. You should know," Dawes said, voice cool, "that your little experiment is being reviewed by higher command. They want to standardize the modification. Finch looked up sharply. Then they believe it works. Dawes smiled thinly. They believe it works. They just won't believe it was you. He paused, letting the words sink in. Effective immediately, you're reassigned. Maintenance Corps, Midlands Division. Agricultural repairs. Finch's jaw tightened. You're sending me away. Consider it a reward, Dawes said. You've done your part. Now let the real engineers handle it. He turned to leave, but Finch's voice stopped him. Sir, Dawes glanced back, eyes hard. Just tell them, Finch said quietly. Tell them it worked because of a spoon, because of a man who didn't give up. Dawes gave a small, almost pitying smile. History doesn't remember spoons, Finch. It remembers results. And with that, he walked away, his boots echoing across the wet concrete until the sound vanished into the night. Finch stood there for a long time, rain dripping from his hair, the spoon still clutched in his fist. Around him, the laughter inside the hangar began to fade, replaced by the steady hum of generators and the soft patter of rain. He looked back toward the planes, his planes gleaming in the half-light. Each one bore a hidden secret under its skin, a small piece of his defiance soldered into its heart. They would never know who saved them, and maybe that was enough. He walked to the edge of the runway, the wind tugging at his coat. Beyond the clouds, the sky was clearing, the faint glow of stars returning after weeks of darkness. He held the spoon up to the light one last time, its surface catching a faint shimmer, the same quiet glint it had the night the idea was born. Then he tucked it carefully into his pocket, turned away from the airfield and started walking. No medals, no speeches, no name in the reports. Just the quiet knowledge that somewhere above the clouds, his invention was keeping men alive. Behind him, a bomber roared to life again, its engines steady, unwavering, flawless. Finch stopped, listening. Then, almost smiling, he whispered to the night, That's enough for me. The engines lifted the plane into the dark sky, glowing faintly against the stars. And as it disappeared into the horizon, Harold Finch, the man who rewired a bomber with a spoon, faded back into the silence of history. Part 1 spring crept quietly across the countryside, softening the scars of war but never erasing them. The airfield where Harold Finch had once worked was still active, though his presence had long faded from its echoing hangars. The men flew on, their bombers stronger, their engines steadier, their deaths less frequent. Yet no one spoke his name. In a small village miles from the front, Finch rose each morning to the sound of sparrows instead of sirens. He lived above a tractor workshop, now a narrow loft that smelled of hay and oil. The tools were simpler, the work slower, but the rhythm of repair felt the same. Metal still spoke to him. It always would. He spent his days fixing farm machines instead of bombers, his fingers stained with the same grease, his mind still chasing perfection. He found comfort in the quiet, in the steady hum of an engine that wanted nothing more than to live. Sometimes, as he worked, he'd pause and listen to the sound of distant aircraft, faint streaks of thunder high above the hills. They always stirred something in him, pride, maybe, or pain. He could never quite tell which. At night, when the lamps were low, he would open the small wooden box on his desk. Inside lay a collection of letters, each one folded neatly, each one signed by a different hand. Thank you, they all began, whoever you are. The first had arrived just weeks after his reassignment. Pilots who'd flown through lightning, who'd come home from missions that should have killed them, had written to an unknown engineer, whose modification had saved their lives. None of them knew his name. None of them ever would. He read those letters often, sometimes with a faint smile, sometimes with a heaviness that words couldn't carry. They were proof that his work had mattered, and yet every line reminded him how easily truth could be erased. The spoon mod, as the crews called it, was now standard issue across the entire Allied fleet. Every bomber carried a version of it, designed and manufactured by official engineers who had never touched the original. Finch's hand-built prototype was gone, stripped and copied, his name replaced by a number in a manual. He didn't resent it, not anymore. History had its way of rewarding silence. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, a boy from the post office brought him a parcel. No return address, just his name H. Finch, written in a hand that trembled slightly. He set it on the table, unwrapped it carefully, and found a small brass plate inside. It was old, scratched, its engraving faint but readable, grounding unit MK. I approved 1943. Beneath it lay a note on yellowed paper. They said it couldn't be done. We knew it could, thank you. There was no signature, only the faint outline of an Air Force emblem at the top. Finch held the plate for a long time. It was heavy, cool, and familiar. The weight of a story that no one would tell. He placed it beside the spoon, still tarnished, still warped, and for the first time in years, he let himself remember everything. The cold air of the hangar, the sound of the rain against steel, the spark that had jumped from metal to flesh and given him the idea that saved them all. Outside, a plane passed low overhead, its engines smooth and even. Finch stepped to the window, watching its lights cut across the twilight sky. They'll never know, he whispered, but they're alive, that's enough. He turned back to his workbench, the hum of his tools blending with the faint rumble above. The world no longer needed his name, it only needed the quiet genius that had once burned through his hands. And so, in that forgotten corner of England, among wheat fields and rusted machines, Harold Finch kept doing what he'd always done, making things that would last longer than he ever could. Part 2, the war ended with no victory parade for Harold Finch. There were no medals, no citations, no mention of his work in the reports that filled the newspapers. To the world, peace had returned through the strength of nations. To Finch, it had come through a single idea born in silence, tested in storms and hidden behind bureaucracy. He heard of the end through the radio one morning. The announcer's voice crackled with triumph, declaring Europe free, the skies safe again. Finch didn't cheer. He simply turned off the radio and stood for a long moment, staring at his hands, the same hands that had built engines of survival while others built engines of war. That afternoon, he walked to the edge of the fields behind his workshop. The land stretched out before him, green and endless, the wind bending the tall grass like waves. It felt strange to look at a horizon not scarred by smoke, strange to breathe without the weight of loss pressing down. He took the spoon from his pocket, its metal worn smooth by time and touch. It had become something of a ritual to carry it, to keep it close, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A small, ordinary thing that once carried a spark strong enough to change fate. As he stood there, an old lorry rumbled down the dirt road toward him. The driver leaned out, a young man in civilian clothes, cap tilted, grin wide. "Mr. Finch, yes, post from the city," the driver said, hopping down and handing over a small envelope. Said it was urgent. Finch nodded his thanks and waited until the engine noise faded before he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, embossed with a government seal. To Harold Finch, former technical engineer, Section 12. Your contribution to the development of the grounding unit has been reviewed by the War Office. While official records must remain classified, the committee acknowledges your role in the early conceptual design. Your innovation saved countless lives. You have our gratitude. Signed, Ministry of Aircraft Production, 1945. There was no medal, no invitation, just that gratitude on paper. Finch smiled faintly. Gratitude was enough. Recognition, in the quiet language of official indifference, was still something. He pinned the letter above his desk, next to the faded sketch of the first grounding circuit he had drawn that night in the hangar. The pencil marks had smudged over the years, but the words beneath were still visible. It's not a fault. It's a frequency. The next day he returned to work. Farmers brought him broken tractors, rusted tools, things that needed more patience than brilliance. He repaired them all without complaint. Sometimes when the radio played, he'd hear stories about new jet engines, faster, stronger, safer than anything that came before. And each time he'd listen with quiet pride. Somewhere inside every machine that took flight, there was a piece of him unseen, unnamed, but there. Years passed that way. The letters stopped coming. The war faded into history. New generations filled the skies, never knowing the ghosts who'd built the wings beneath them. One evening, long after the sun had gone down, Finch sat outside his workshop with a cup of tea and the hum of crickets for company. He looked up at the star's countless tiny lights, steady and unblinking, and thought of the bombers that once carried his invention through storms. He reached into his pocket and felt the spoon again, cool against his palm. The metal had dulled with age, but the memory it carried burned bright. Funny, he murmured, all that brilliance, and it fit in the palm of my hand. The night air was calm. From far away he thought he heard the faint echo of engines, not the roar of war, but the soft, distant rhythm of peace. He smiled, closed his eyes, and let the sound carry him back to the hangar, the rain, the spark that had changed everything. In that moment, Harold Finch was not forgotten, not by history nor by the sky. Part 1 decades passed. The war that had once devoured the world became a story told in classrooms, its horrors flattened into photographs and textbook paragraphs. The bombers that had ruled the skies were now museum pieces, silent giants, resting in hangars under polished lights. One such hangar stood on the outskirts of Cambridge, its air still faintly scented with oil and memory. Tourists came to see the restored aircraft, to touch history without feeling its heat. Children pressed their faces against the glass displays, marveling at the engines that once thundered over Europe. In a quiet corner of the exhibit, behind a glass case labelled Innovations of the Air War, lay a curious object, a tarnished metal spoon. No plaque explained it properly. The card beside it read only, Grounding Prototype RAF 1943, Origin Unknown. Most visitors passed it by. But one man didn't. Dr. Samuel Wren, a curator and historian, had spent the last year cataloguing old maintenance records for a new exhibit on wartime engineering. He had seen every tool, every blueprint, every patent filed by the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Yet when he found that spoon among a box of rusted parts, something about it had stopped him cold. It wasn't the shape. It was the way the handle was scorched and warped, as if it had once held lightning. Wren couldn't let it go. He started digging through archives, following whispers of an unregistered modification that had appeared across RAF bases in early 1943. The more he searched, the more the same name appeared in scribbled margins and unsigned reports. Finch. One evening after the museum had closed, Wren sat in his office surrounded by piles of old documents. The air smelled of dust and ink. He opened a faded personnel log, the paper thin as skin. Corporal Harold Finch, Section 12, RAF Maintenance Division, reassigned, April 1943, Agricultural Engineering, Midlands. There was nothing else. No commendation, no record of discharge, no death notice. Just a name moved off the page as quietly as it had entered it. Wren leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You clever, invisible man," he whispered. He found more fragments of Finch, his work hidden in technical memos, circuit diagrams copied without credit, a photograph of a young mechanic standing beside a bomber, his face half in shadow. Every clue led deeper into a mystery that felt less like research and more like resurrection. By winter, Wren had pieced together the truth. The spoon wasn't a curiosity. It was the heart of a forgotten innovation, the device that had saved hundreds of airmen and changed the design of every aircraft that followed. The realization left him breathless. History had remembered the machines, the missions, the medals, but not the man who had kept them alive. He knew what he had to do. A week later, under the cold glow of the museum's lights, Wren began drafting a proposal. He wrote with the urgency of a man correcting a wound in time. This is not an artifact of war. He wrote, but of compassion. The invention known unofficially as the spoon mod was the work of Corporal Harold Finch, a field engineer who defied orders and rewired fate itself. His story deserves to be told. He signed his name, dated it, and slipped it under the director's door before leaving for the night. Outside, the snow fell softly over the city. Wren paused on the museum steps, looking up at the pale sky. He imagined Finch older now, perhaps gone, unaware that someone was still listening to the echoes of his work. He smiled to himself. "We'll bring you home," he said quietly. "I promise." Back inside, the last of the lights dimmed. Only one remained, a faint reflection off the spoon behind the glass, catching the glow like a star refusing to fade. Months passed before Dr. Samuel Wren's proposal reached the committee. Bureaucracy moved slowly, even for truth. But word began to spread through quiet corridors and historian circles. There was once a mechanic who saved hundreds with nothing but a spoon. By the following spring, the museum prepared a new exhibit, Forgotten Innovators of the War. The centerpiece wasn't a general's uniform or a pilot's medal. It was a small, curved piece of tarnished metal resting under glass. Beside it hung a black and white photograph of Harold Finch, his face half, hidden by shadow, eyes fixed on something far beyond the frame. Opening day arrived under gentle rain. Families wandered through the exhibit, the air filled with murmured awe. Veterans in worn coats stopped before the display, reading the plaque in silence. Royal Air Force engineer. Developed the first prototype grounding system used in Allied bombers, preventing catastrophic in-flight explosions. His work, known informally as the Spoon Mod, saved over 200 airmen's lives. Forgotten in official records, rediscovered through his surviving notes and field modifications. Proof that genius doesn't always wear rank. Visitors lingered there longer than anywhere else. Some smiled. Some cried. Many simply stood still, lost in the quiet nobility of it all. Wren watched from a distance, hands clasped behind his back. He had insisted the lighting be soft, not dramatic, not heroic, just honest. The kind of light that Harold Finch might have worked under. He turned to an elderly man sitting in the corner, eyes glistening behind thick glasses. "You knew him, didn't you?" Wren asked gently. The man nodded slowly. "Back at the field," he said. His voice was a whisper cracked with memory. "He used to talk to the machines, treated them like they could hear him. We thought he was mad. Turns out he was just right." Wren smiled faintly. "He never got to see what he built become history." The man chuckled softly. "Maybe he didn't need to. The sky knew his name." As the day faded and the visitors trickled out, the lights dimmed one by one, until only a single beam remained shining on the spoon. Its surface gleamed faintly under the glass, the reflection trembling like a pulse. Somewhere, deep in the hum of the building, the faint vibration of passing aircraft rolled through the walls, a low, rhythmic sound that felt almost alive. Wren looked up, listening. He imagined Finch standing under that same sound decades ago, hands covered in oil, eyes alight with stubborn hope. He imagined the spark leaping from wire to spoon, the beginning of something no one else could see. In that moment, it didn't feel like the end of a story, but its continuation, an invisible line stretching from one act of courage to every quiet brilliance that followed. Wren whispered, "You're home now, Harold." The museum fell silent again. The glass reflected only one thing: the spoon, resting beneath a small engraved plaque. It wasn't luck that changed history that day. It was genius, the kind born not from comfort, but from desperation. Outside, the rain eased into a soft drizzle. A plane crossed the night sky, its engine steady, its wings catching the dim light of the moon. And below it, inside the quiet hall, the legacy of a forgotten mind finally gleamed, not as an artifact of war, but as proof that sometimes the smallest hands leave the largest marks on history.